I did want to actually answer a couple of questions that I've gotten and some comments that I get. So, people joke around with me and they'll say, hey, can you dumb it down for me this week, right? Or this is, or even more directly, this is really complicated. I don't know that I understand everything, right? And listen, that is exactly right. It is very likely that I don't expect you to remember every single thing that I say. And I don't expect that you're going to understand every word that I say. However, what you will do is you will catch on to enough that as we continue on, you will start to see things yourself and you'll be like, oh, that's like when he said this, or when we talked about that. Or you'll just start thinking in terms of the way they thought in the ancient world. And you'll be like, oh, this is happening because they believe that whatever, right? That is my goal. I don't expect that you're going to come away every week. This is not a class, like a seminary class, right? Now, I'm going to treat it like a seminary class, but you're not going to get homework, except, you're supposed to be reading your stuff, right? But you're not going to take any tests, and I'm not going to quiz you. Just for the record, I may ask sometimes in general if anybody knows anything, but I am never going to point you out and say, Steve, will you answer the question about, I'm not going to do that, right? And so, but I promise you, if you stay with it, it will start coming together. But I know several of you have been in this class for a long time, even before we were doing this, and you're making those connections, right? And I see that all the time. And so if you walk away from this thinking, I didn't understand everything that he said, then welcome to the club. Neither did most anybody else, right? And listen, I have to study this over and over and over. For every lesson, I read several different books. Like, it's funny, I told them last week that, so on Sunday, I did the lesson, like the previous Sunday, not this past Sunday, but the previous Sunday, I did the lesson. Well, I didn't like the way I did one part, so I read another book for Wednesday night so that I could retool it and do it. So that's okay, right? I don't expect that you're going to read a bunch of books and stuff, but if you'll just pay attention and try to follow along as best you can, you'll get it. You'll get it. It's okay that you don't understand everything, right? You'll learn the information and you'll realize as you go along. So today, and in some of the other stuff, and this is a Wendy question actually, she's like, why are we jumping around so much, right? Can we not just go through and I'm like, okay, well, for the laws and stuff, it's pretty much we have to jump around, right? Because several places may have the same laws or the same or information that kind of you can put it all together about certain laws, and so we'll have to do that. But when we get to the narrative sections, that's when we will go more. Now, we're not going to go verse by verse because we just don't have time for that. But we will go more in an order to where we kind of go, this story, and then we'll do this story and this story. But inherently, when you do Bible study, there's going to be some jumping around because there are going to be things that relate in other books. So like, for instance, when we get to the books of Kings and then you have the prophets are going to be all intertwined in that, there's going to be jumping around. If you pay attention to your reading plan as you're reading, and not just, which I do, just for the, I'm not saying you're bad if you do this, but like I'll generally just kind of read through, and then when I go back to do my study part, then I'll realize, oh, wait a minute, this was from Numbers, and this was from Leviticus, and this was from Exodus, and all of that. And so even the plan itself jumps around, right? So I'm not just ADHD and just, throwing a bunch of stuff out at you. I may be ADHD, but that's not the reason that it's jumping around in this, right? And so when we get to the narrative literature, it will be a little more, chronological, right? Just for the record. All right. So last week, we talked about a lot of information. And so part of that had to deal with, of course, we introduced the law. And if you'll remember again what we talked about last week, the law in the ancient world and in the Old Testament is not meant necessarily as a follow all of these laws directly. It's more of these are examples of what good justice looks like. So therefore, learn from these so that when you go to judge yourself, you will know what good justice looks like. And so it's more of examples than it is necessarily specific rules that are meant to be followed to the letter of the law, if you will. And we see that because we see people do all kinds of things in the Old Testament that are in the law that they should have been killed for, that they don't get killed for, right? And so again, they serve as examples. So the point of the law is to show, whereas a good king in the ancient world would provide his people with a law code so that the people around would say, oh, this king presents order in his kingdom, so that's a high standard in the ancient world. Well, that's what the law does for Israel. The God of Israel, who is their king, the God of Israel presents order through the law. And he expects his people who are judging to be just judges and to follow the examples as set forth in the law itself, right? So we're going to kind of go through some of that, and it will constantly refer back to those ideas. The first thing I wanted to talk about is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? This is a very misunderstood concept. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth does not mean you killed me, so I'm going to kill you better, right? That's not the point of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It is not permission to do to others as they did to you, right? It is a lessening of the punishments in the ancient world. So for instance, and we still see it today, right? If you go to some ancient Near Eastern places, you may end up in a situation where if you steal, you may get your hand chopped off, right? And what an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth says is you can't chop somebody's hand off for stealing from you. They owe you monetary compensation, but you can't like chop their hand off or kill them, right? And things like that. You see this even as we get into the New Testament, right? So you get the ancient world is, pretty much, unless they had a legal code, but the Canaanites did not. And so it's pretty much, harsh living, and you better not wrong somebody because they may just kill you. To the Old Testament law, which is, no, you can't do that. You have to, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? You can't do worse to others than they've done to you. Then you get to Jesus, and Jesus says what? Turn the other cheek, right? And so then you get even a higher level of law. Now, I did want to say one thing about that. When Jesus says not an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, he didn't say that. When Jesus says turn the other cheek, just so you know, Jesus is not saying that you cannot defend yourself ever in any instance. He's certainly not saying you can't defend your family or anything like that. The Greek behind that whole language of if someone, I can't remember the word the English translation uses, but basically hits you on the cheek or whatever it is. The Greek behind that is like an insult, right? And so I always liken it into the old Bugs Bunny cartoons, right? Where, he would take his glove and he would slap somebody, and that was an insult, and they would, how dare you, sir, right? And so that's more what we're talking about. We're talking about a slap in terms of an insult, right? And so he's saying in a situation where someone is insulting you, you just let it go, right? He's not saying if somebody's coming at your family with a knife that, you can't defend your family. I'll just say it that way. You can't defend your family. All right, so wisdom. We talked about the laws themselves as wisdom because, again, the point is not necessarily prescriptive that these laws are to be followed to the letter of the law. It's more to provide wisdom so that you see the laws and they provide you with an example of what good justice looks like. And you look at that and say, oh, in these specific cases, this is what justice looks like. So when I'm presented with this case over here, then I can apply that same thinking. Now I can rule justly. And so it's more wisdom literature than it is necessarily what we think of in modern terms of as law. And so why do we need that in the ancient, or let's say the Israelite law code? Well, because of things like where Exodus 23, 1 and 2 say, you shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice. Or, skipping on to 23:6 through 8, you shall not pervert justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. All of these are for people who are judging, right? It's saying you can't subvert justice against poor people just because they're poor. And you have these rich people, like if a poor person says, hey, this rich person stole my land, and then the rich person says, hey, here's some money for your whatever, your re-election campaign. Obviously, they didn't have that back then, but your re-election campaign, right? Because that would never happen today, right? Shocking, right? And so it's to prevent things like that. It's saying you can't do that. And then what do we get throughout the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets? We get exactly that. We get the law of Israel corrupted. The justice system is corrupted for rich people and kings and others. And then the poor are thrown aside. And you see that over and over and over. You see it in the books of Kings with Elijah and Elisha talking about it, all the different prophets. Why are we exiled as Israelites? Not we literally, but the Israelites. Why are they exiled? Well, idolatry, clearly, right? And that's a major deal. And then not taking care of the widow, the fatherless, the poor. And much of that was in the judicial system, right? Where we're taking things from the poor because they can't fight back. And the judicial system has been turned against them. And so it's those things. And so that, again, that's the point. And you get those specific, examples provided in the law of the Old Testament because that's a big deal, perverting justice. And so we still see it today, in some areas. We would like to think that our justice system is fantastic, and I do believe that our justice system is fantastic, but that doesn't mean it's perfect, right? We still see examples where justice is, if you've seen this Murdaugh guy, allegedly killed his, we'll find out, I guess, in the next few days. He allegedly killed his wife and son, but regardless of how you look, like he admitted to perverting justice over and over and over again, right? Now, he may not have killed his those people, but he admitted that he perverted justice over and over and over again, right? And so there you have an example where, our justice system also fails at times. Okay. Another thing that we talked about yesterday that we're going to exemplify. We said that we talked about covenants with kings, between kings and their subservience, right? So what we call a vassal king or an underling king. And we said that a king is glorified in his treatment of the vassal, whether the vassal is loyal and he is treating the vassal well, or if the vassal tries to rise up against and rebel, and then what does the king need to do to still be glorified? He needs to discipline them, right? And so therefore, he is still glorified, right? Either way, the king looks good because he's taking care of business. Either people under him are doing really well when they don't rebel, or he squashes them when they rebel, and either way, the king looks good. Okay, so again, whereas the Old Testament covenant is set up like one of those covenant treaties between a higher king and a vassal king, it's set up just like that between God, the King of Israel, and his people. And we get exactly that. God is glorified whether his people are doing well or whether he has to punish them, right? It's the same difference. That's why when you get to things like the exile, and God says, okay, I'm giving you chance after chance after chance, but listen, now you're out of there, right? I mean, you're going to be exiled and all these terrible things are going to happen. And we look at that and we think, oh gosh, but then of course we think, well, but I mean, they did go against God. Well, again, in the ancient world, this is the way it works, right? If you rebel, you're going to be punished. And God is glorified amongst the ancient Near Eastern people because of exactly that. So if you look, for instance, at Leviticus 10, 1 through 7, and you have this situation with Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, who each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. So this is Aaron's sons, two of his sons, right? And so whatever they've done exactly, they have done something that they weren't supposed to do in a ritual format, right? So they're trying to, whatever they're trying to do, they're trying to make a sacrifice or whatever they're doing, and it goes against what God told them to do. And so God does not play around about it. He burns them up, right? And they catch on fire and they are burned to death, right? Said, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord, right? Then Moses said to Aaron, so then Moses goes to their father and says, this is what the Lord has said. Among those who are near me, I will be sanctified. And before all the people, I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. So he goes to Aaron and says exactly what I just told you. God will be glorified whether it's when people are doing well or whether it's in punishment. And he burns up Aaron's sons, and Moses goes and says, see, God is going to be glorified in this. And it's glorified because the other people look and they say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to make that mistake, right? And so he is glorified. And so there you have it. So then, let's see. Yeah. All right, so let's continue on. And Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Uzziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said to them, come near, carry your brothers away from the front of the sanctuary and out of the camp, right? So it's like, hey, get them out of here. They're stinking up the place. So they came near and carried them in their coats out of the camp, as Moses had said. And Moses said to Aaron and to Eleazar and Ithamar, all these people with these complicated names, his sons, do not let the hair of your heads hang loose, and do not tear your clothes, lest you die, and wrath come upon all the congregation. But let your brothers, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning that the Lord has kindled. And do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die, for the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moses. So he even warns him. He's like, look, this has happened. It's done. You feel free to mourn, but don't stir up any trouble, right? Like it's done and God is glorified. If you go out and you try to stir up any kind of trouble, or if people see you wailing and tearing your clothes and stuff, then they're going to be like, well, wait a minute. I mean, God, why did God do that? And then Aaron, the high priest, he's upset, and it may create a disturbance where God is then not glorified. And so Moses says, look, don't mess this up, right? It's done. You're just going to have to suck it up. And I mean, it was the right thing. God is glorified, and you're just going to have to deal with it. And again, that seems harsh, but that's exactly what they would have expected in the ancient world and in ancient Israel. All right. As you read, again, through the law and continuing on through the prophets and everywhere in the Old Testament, you will have this overarching theme of don't be like the Canaanites, right? And sometimes don't be like the Canaanites is the answer to your questions, right? So when you say, well, why in the world does it say that you can't do this weird thing, right? And a lot of times Bible scholars will say, we have no idea. We don't have any, there's no other text or anything in the ancient world that tells us, what this means or whatever. And so you just say, you know what? It's probably something that the Canaanites did, right? You just blame the Canaanites. It's probably something the Canaanites did. And God is saying, do not do like those people, because that is a consistent theme. And so you can kind of, if it's weird, then it's probably that. It's probably something that they did. So Leviticus 20, 23 through 24 says, and you shall not walk in the customs of the nation that I am driving out before you, for they did all these things, and therefore I detested them. But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess. a land flowing with milk and honey. I'm the Lord your God who has separated you from the peoples, right? So you are to be separate from those peoples and not do the things that they do. And remember when we talked about the law last week in the comparison, even though the law of the Old Testament is framed in a similar way to those legal codes, one of the major differences is, again, that God is the author of the law and not the king. And so, but in many ways it is very similar, right? But the point there is to show that God creates order. And so therefore he expects order from his people. That's what his people expect from a good and just king. That's what the ancient Near Eastern people expect. If there's like a fancy king who's really got it together, he's going to create a law code. And so that's what he does. So he does use many of the things that they would have been familiar with, but there are many things that they're not allowed to do. Exodus 23, 32 through 33 says, you shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Again, what do they end up doing? Exactly that. The whole point is they end up not driving all the people out. And then, because they're like, well, if we make treaties with these people, we'll be even more spectacular, right? Because, man, we'll have all these other people that are on our side and all of that. Well, then they, of course, end up following their gods, and then they're exiled, right? So we've got the major issues right here. We've got idolatry, which they end up doing. We've got the judicial system corrupted. That's we pretty much covered the main bad things in the Old Testament, right? They all fall in those categories. So basically, when you get to something crazy that's like, don't do this weird thing, it's probably because the Canaanites did it, right? And so, just say, I put in my notes, literally, if all else fails, it must be about the Canaanites. All right? All right, I'm going to go kind of quickly through the different types of offerings and just I'm going to give you the name of the offering, the animals that are used, and the reason, okay? And those are in a few different sections, and so it is easy. I'm going to go ahead and I am going to suggest a book for you, all right? It's from John Walton. Again, I like John Walton. It's called Chronological and Background Charts of the Old Testament. Chronological and Background Charts of the Old Testament, for those of you who are, make sure you get that written down. If you go to my YouTube channel and look on there, there is a link to that. Now listen, I understand that sounds god-awful boring, all right? And it's not a book you read, okay? It's not a reading book. It is a book that has, like for instance, and I took this information directly out. He actually had more information, but it's like all the laws dealing with different things, all of the offerings, all of the holy days, all of it, anything that's in the Old Testament, it pretty much has all the kings and their years and all of that stuff. And it's easy at a glance. It's not like you have to read a bunch of material. It's in a chart, right? And you just look at the chart and then it's like, boom. So when you're like reading about, Ahab, for instance, if you're King Ahab, you just go flick, 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 flick. Say, oh, Ahab lived in whatever year, right? Or he was the king from this year to that year. And so that's kind of how you know all that stuff. And so it gives you, when you're like, man, all these offerings they have to give, you just flip, 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 flip. You find that page, and then it tells you, and it gives you all the verses that tell you about those offerings. So it's a good study aid, right? And once you find that on Amazon, you'll find many others that are related. They're all by Zondervan. And so you have one about the New Testament. You can even do the Christian church, where it has all of church history and all of that. So again, mine is, I like the chronological and background charts of the Old Testament because it has all that information. And then the New Testament one, that is New Testament background or something like that, but it goes through all the Gospels and when they're written, and all the other books and when they're written, and Paul's travels and chart forms. I like charts and graphs and maps and stuff. So again, I'm a nerd, but it is helpful, just for the record. Even for non-nerd, you don't have to be a nerd to appreciate it. All right, so burnt offerings. All right, so the burnt offering is a male without blemish. The animal is according to wealth. Right? So the burnt offering is a male without blemish. an animal according to wealth. So in other words, if I have a lot of money, I can do a bull or a goat or whatever, a cow. But if I'm poor, then I could do a bird, right? I could do a clean bird. This is for propitiation of general sin, and it demonstrates dedication, all right? And that's basically spelled out in Leviticus 1. A meal or tribute offering is made up of unleavened cakes or grains. This is a general thankfulness offering for first fruits, right? And that's in Leviticus 2. A peace offering is a male or female without blemish according to wealth, again. And so a blemish is allowed, strangely enough, right? So it can be slightly blemished. It can be slightly flawed. It can have a couple of dents. And that's going to be in Leviticus 3 and then also 22:18 through 30. But there's 3 types, right? So you have the thank offering, which is for unexpected blessings. You have the vow offering, which is for deliverance when a vow was made. And then a free will offering is general thankfulness, right? So thank offering. Wow, suddenly I came into this money. Thank you, God. And I give a thank offering. A vow offering. God, if this works out, I vow that blah, 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 right? And then boom, that works out. I do a vow offering. Free will offering. You know what? Things have been going pretty well lately. I think I'm going to go give a thank offer or a free will offering, right? And so general thankfulness. Thank you, God. Sin offering. All right, so this has several different aspects to it, because if you are a priest or if it is for the congregation, then it is a bull you need. If you are the king, then it's a goat that you need. And individuals, it can be a she-goat. And this is when purification is needed, all right? And then you have a guilt offering. That is in Leviticus 4. And then you have a guilt offering. A guilt offering is a ram without blemish. This is when, this is the way it says in the book, when desecration occurs or objective guilt, right? So objective guilt means that everybody knows it, right? Like this is like, oh yeah. You know, like sometimes you go to your friends and you're like, hey, listen, let me tell you what happened. Tell me if I was wrong, you know? And sometimes you're like, I don't know, you know, I think you did the right thing and, you know, whatever. But then sometimes you're like, oh no, you shouldn't have done that. Like that, yeah, you were wrong for that, right? Okay, so that's, I would think, objective guilt, right? So everybody hears your story and says, oh no, you should have done that. So then you need to go do that offering. All right, blood in the Old Testament. There's so much, right? So again, let me just point out that, you know, they carry those animals up there and then they just slit their throats right there on the spot. And it's a bloody business. And so, so what does that mean? Well, first of all, you have to understand the idea of holiness, right? So what does holiness mean? Holiness is when something is separated out from the common, right? So this is so for instance, I have silverware in my silverware drawer, right? It's all exactly the same, right? We used to have different silverware that we collected over the years, and I'm like, I wear the same thing every day. I'm like, I can't do that anymore. So I ordered several sets of the exact same silverware so that I never have to see a different, and I have backstock so that I'm thinking that I can get through this for the rest of my life. I don't ever want to have to buy it again. So I can't just go and use that in the temple, right? I can't take a fork and then use that to do something, you know, or some tongs or whatever, and like mess with the meat that goes to God, right? That has to be a special set of tongs, right? It can't be my grilling ones that I have out at the Blackstone, right? So they have to be set apart. They're only to be used for God. And you can do that for both implements like tongs and pitchforks that they use to, you know, pull the meat out or whatever they did. All of those things that are involved in the temple, right? They have to be set apart. But you can also set apart people, right? So if you're going and you're in the service of God, you also have to be set apart, right? You can't just be like, you know, hanging out at the club and then be like, I think I'm going to go, take some sacrifices and pour the blood out on the altar, right? Because no, you will catch on fire, right? God will kill you, okay? And they didn't play, you know, God did not play around. Again, because that's just in the ancient world. So note that blood served as a cleansing agent, right? to make a person or even things able to appear before God or to be used in the service of God, or to make one or something holy. And so for us, we use Clorox, right? And we're like, okay, Clorox is going to make this thing clean, right? Or bleach or whatever. Not in there. They were like, pour blood on it, right? And we think blood, like if you get blood on the carpet, you get new carpet, right? I mean, that's just the way they looked at it. And for whatever reason, that's what Israel chose to be the cleansing thing, right? Other people did not treat blood that way in the ancient world. Like we compare all these different things. Well, blood was not a deal in the other places. That's why you can't eat meat with blood in it, right? Because that's what the other people did. Here, blood is used for cleansing. If one appeared before God in an unclean state, then death would result, right? The death of an animal and its blood are a substitute for the death of the person. So I deserve death. And when I go and I sacrifice the animal, my death is then put on the animal. And so the animal itself is a substitute for my death. The sacrifices remove the barrier of sin and allows the Israelites to remain in fellowship with Yahweh. Note that the sacrifices are an ongoing daily or yearly requirement. The sacrifices were not meant to save one from sins, but to show faith and keep one in a proper relationship with Yahweh. One is still saved by faith in God, which is shown through acts based on the law, which includes social justice, like taking care of the poor and all of those things. So again, that sacrificial system does not save me. Just like in the New Testament, works don't save me, right? But if I believe in God, I'm going to do what God says, and therefore I'm going to show that through my fruits. In the Old Testament, the way I showed that through my fruits was I did the works of the law and did those things. But again, as the law is an example of how people and things and everything are to be treated, then it's about justice to other people and our relationships with God and with other people. That's the deal. That's the way that we show that we are faithful to God. So if we then look toward the New Testament, Jesus provides the death that substitutes for our own spiritual death. Just like in the Old Testament sacrificial system, where the animal's blood substituted for the person's death, well, Jesus' blood substitutes for our spiritual death, right? So it's the same type of idea. We are still saved by faith in God, which is then shown through our acts based on the law, but the law is provided by Jesus, who fulfilled the requirements of the Old Testament law. Note that those still have to do with social justice and all of that, treating people well, right? We are still saved by grace through faith, just like in the Old Testament. The fruits of the Spirit or our following God's word is still the evidence of our salvation. And if you'll remember from last week, when we talked about the law as an example, like when we think of the law as all these prescriptions, and just for the record, they did those things, right? But we think of them as, follow to the letter of the law as far as these are specific laws and these are the only ones. Well, they had other things that they had to do. They had other laws and such that aren't stipulated. And we know that some of the things that are in the law, they never actually did. And we talked about last week that some of the laws are very likely theoretical, right? Some of the stranger ones, they're just theoretical in the first place. Because again, the point is to show you what good justice looks like so that you will then copy it in different cases that may not be actually specified in the law. So when we look at the law as an example of justice, instead of looking at it as a specific stipulations of exact things that they had to accomplish, it makes much more sense that Jesus fulfilled the law. Because the law served as an example of how we should treat people and God, and Jesus serves as an example of how we should treat people and God, right? What does Jesus say is the most important commandment? Love God And then one related to that is love people, right? That's the thing. That's how Jesus fulfills the law, is he provides the perfect example of justice, right? And that justice ultimately is sacrifice, right? That's why love God and your neighbor embodies the whole example of what the law is about, right? I find that fascinating. All right, so eating blood, Leviticus 17, 10 through 12. If anyone of the house of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn among them eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from amongst his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. It's blood that makes things clean, however that works. Therefore, I've said to the people of Israel, no person among you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger who sojourns among you eat blood. Because blood is the means of purification, eating the blood is not allowed. This is what we used to purify with. You're not allowed to eat it, okay? So what does it mean to eat blood, right? Well, note that 1 Samuel 14, 32 through 33 defines what it means to eat meat without the blood. It says, the people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground. And the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood. And he said, you have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here, right? So note, the stone is going to be used as an altar to pour the blood out, right? To make this all clean and all of the stuff that they're doing. And so what they've done is they've won in a battle, and then they just start cutting up animals and they're just eating meat. It sounds like they're eating it raw, right? But it's possible that maybe they're cooking it, but they've not properly drained the blood out of the meat. Because again, blood is meant for purification. You're not allowed to eat it. And this is one of those things that separates them from the ancient Near Eastern people around them. Okay, Exodus 20, 25 through 26, dealing with uncut stones and looking under clothes at the altar, right? Okay. Exodus 20, 25 through 26 says this, if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it. Okay? All right. So we're not allowed to use tools on the stones, right? And then we're also not allowed to build steps, because when we go up the steps, our nether regions will be visible to the steps and the altar, and therefore that's bad, right? So we don't want to do that. So note that the use of tools, this is very unclear as to exactly what's going on, but it seems that the use of tools seem to be prohibited because tools are associated with death, right? The Mishnah, all right, so the Mishnah, what is the Mishnah? All right, so you've got the Old Testament law, okay? Then you've got the time of Jesus, where Jesus rails against the Pharisees and everybody and says, hey, you're adding to the law and all of these different things, right? Then you get about 200 and some odd years later, and you have the Jewish people codify what we call the oral law, which seems to be what Jesus was upset about. It is additions to the law. It's basically Jewish interpretation of the law. So look, the law says you can't work on Sunday, okay? Well, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? Like, clearly I can't go to the school, right? Which I do all the time. But I can't go to the school and work, right? But, I mean, can I cook? I mean, I think it says in the Old Testament you're not supposed to cook, maybe. But there are other things that I don't know. Maybe. Does this work? Does this not work? I don't know. Well, the Mishnah explains those things for you. So, for instance, you can walk up an incline that's this steep, but you can't walk up an incline this steep. This is not work. This is work, right? And so those things seem to be from the time of Jesus. But we don't know 100%. So it could be there's some things in the Mishnah that were after Jesus that were added, but we don't know for sure. But Jesus clearly seems to be talking about those types of rules that are added on top of the law to make the Jewish people's lives harder. And it's like, okay, well, we're going to define all these things for you, right? So, for instance, one of my favorites, which is extremely cold, Jesus talks about that you can, that Moses said that you can serve your wife, divorce papers or whatever it says it, for cause, right? And then he talks about, I say, if you think about whatever that is. That's not the point. The point is what he's talking about. Notice that it doesn't talk about women divorcing their husbands, because that doesn't really happen much in the New Testament world, right? It's generally a man divorcing his wife. And why do men divorce their wives? Because they get too old for them, right? And too old for them is probably not very old, right? And so Moses said you can give your wife a certificate of divorce. That's what it's described as, a certificate of divorce with cause or for cause. Well, the Mishnah defines what cause is, right? And the Mishnah says that if your wife burns the bread, then that gives you cause to divorce her. And so why would that be? Because I don't want her anymore because she's 25 or whatever. She's an old woman. She's 25, right? And so I need to divorce her. I need cause to divorce her. So we need to get, of course, the men are the ones that get together and, figure out all these oral laws. And so they decide, hey, that's what that means. Is Moses is saying that if she burns the bread, that's cause for divorce, right? That's bad stuff. So the Mishnah says they did not plaster them, talking about the altars. They did not plaster them with an iron trowel, lest it touch and invalidate them. For iron is created to shorten man's days, and the altar is created to lengthen man's days. It is not fitting that which shortens man's days should be waived over that which lengthens man's days. So because iron is seen as an implement of war, they say that's the reason they couldn't use tools on the altars, because you don't use metal because of that. Now, it is also possible, and some scholars will theorize, that it's possible that it's because since they're around all these ancient Near Eastern people, and generally when you made an altar, you would carve different symbols and stuff in the rocks. If you used a tool on it, then you might be tempted to carve things on the altar, and you're not allowed to do that, right? And so it's possible that it's that, but ultimately we don't know exactly why you can't use tools on it. All right, but concerning the nakedness and the altar, it could also be related to Exodus 28:42 through 43, which says, "You shall make for them linen undergarments to cover their naked flesh. They shall reach from the hips to the thighs, and they shall be on Aaron and on his sons when they go into the tent of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister in the holy place, lest they bear guilt and die," right? So this is a serious deal. "This shall be a statute forever for him and for his offspring after him." So note, in the ancient world, there seems to have been pagan religious rituals where the priests were naked, right? And they absolutely, we know in many instances, included sexual rituals. Why did they have sexual rituals at temples in the ancient world? Does anybody remember? Okay, so we hear about shrine prostitutes in the Bible, right? Or temple prostitution, okay? So I go to the temple of Baal, right? Baal is the god of storms, and so he's the one who makes it rain. That's why you get Elijah with the battle between Yahweh and Baal. Who's going to make it rain, right? Oh, I'm sorry, who's going to rain fire down? And the whole point of all that is we need it to rain. There is a drought, right? And we need it to rain. And so we're going to have a battle between Yahweh and Baal. And the whole point of the end of that battle is once we see that Yahweh is the one who can bring the fire, and then it starts raining, we have proven that Yahweh is the one who brings the rain, not Baal, who Jezebel is saying is the one who's going to bring the rain. And so basically, you get Yahweh and Baal, and it's like, okay, well, Baal's going to get credit for whatever Yahweh does. So basically, Yahweh just beats the heck out of Baal and leaves him bloody on the floor. And then it's like, okay, well, when it rains, you're going to know he didn't do it because he's passed out, right? So that's kind of the deal. I mean, that's the point. We've proved that Yahweh can bring the fire. So now it's going to rain, and it does. It rains right after that. And that's the whole point, is it wasn't Baal that brought the rain. It was Yahweh. So if I want it to rain, I'm going to go to a temple of Baal. And Ashtoreth is his wife, right? And so I'm going to go to the temple. And there is a prostitute there, right? And then the prostitute and I are going to do the deed. And then, and so that has to do with fertility, right? And so that's going to spark Baal and Ashtoreth to do the deed in the divine realm. And then that's going to create fertility. It's going to rain. It's going to do whatever happens, right? So that's the reason that they have shrine prostitutes, or at least that's what they say the reason is, right? That's their excuse for going to the shrine prostitutes. And just for the record, I don't doubt that they believed that, that kind of stuff worked. So it is very likely that all of this stuff is rules against being naked anywhere near the temple or the tabernacle or anything like that, because it's saying, listen, do not bring that freaky stuff in here. There will be no sexual stuff going on in the service of God. Like, we don't do that around here, okay? And so that's the point. And so it would seem that's the deal, is there will be no nakedness. And so if you even have to wear underwear, then you're definitely not going to be able to do the other stuff that the ancient people are doing. So don't even think about it, right? All right. So much stuff. Okay. All right. Slavery in the Old Testament. Okay. So Exodus 21:20, it talks about slavery there. I'm going to go kind of quickly through this just so we can get through some of this. Slavery was a staple of the ancient world. Okay. And there were two forms of slavery in Israel. All right. There was forced slavery, which usually came from defeated enemies. And then you had debt slaves, which were the vast majority of slaves in the ancient world, period. Particularly when you get to Roman times, you have debt slaves. And that means either A, I can't pay my bills, or I can't get food. I can't get food. And so therefore I'm going to sell myself into slavery because at least then I can eat, right? Or I've got a wife, I've got 2 sons and a daughter, okay? I can't feed all these mouths, right? So I'm going to sell my daughter into slavery because I need the 2 male children to carry on my name and lineage and to have other heirs and all of that. So I'm going to sell the daughter, right? Because she is the less useful to me. That's just the way they looked at it in the ancient world. Now that seems very cold, but it is to provide for her as well, because once she's sold into slavery, she is going to get food. She's going to get all of that. We have stuck in our minds transatlantic African slavery. Every time you hear the word slavery, you think of that, right? Well, and which is obviously horrible, right? But that's not necessarily what all of this is. Now, the forced slavery with people you've taken, that would be, to an extent, more like that. But debt slaves is a different deal. Debt slaves are people that I'm not saying that it's good, right? I'm not saying that it was a happy life, but it was potentially the only way that you would survive, right? So rules for the treatment of Israelite slaves were stricter than they were for foreign slaves. Israelite slaves could only be kept for 6 years, and then they were required to be released on the 7th year. The law does provide for the general well-being of slaves, both foreign and Israelite. These legal specifications for slave treatment would have been above average in terms of civility in the ancient world. Again, though, we still have to understand that these were much harsher times that they lived in, right? And they saw things very differently than we see them, and they had to live in a different way than we do today. Exodus 21:17, and the death of a child who dishonors his father or mother. So Exodus 21:17 says, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. Okay, that's pretty specific, all right? Note that the ancient Israelites lived in an honor-shame society. And the word here underlying curses means disregarding, making light of, showing a lack of respect. Well, note that again, this type of treatment breaks down order in society, and the whole point of the law is to create order among God's people. And so this breaks down order, because if your son goes out and treats you this way and other people see it, then they're going to start acting that way. And then all of society, and remember in this time period, you have, it's the sons and such that have to take care of the parents later on. We're living large families where you have to take control and you have to, provide for the families. And if we get people just doing their own thing, then that's not gonna work, right? So having such a law in the legal code would again show the expectations of Yahweh for his people. I cannot think of a time, I can think of many places where sons particularly do bad things in the Old Testament, but I can't think. God kills a few, but I can't think of a place where a father kills his son for anything like that, right? This is when you get to the New Testament and you get to the prodigal son. Notice he mistreats his father, right? And so he could be killed. And he comes back expecting, harsh punishment and all this stuff. But then, of course, the point there is that the father takes him in, right? Of course, that's a parable, and it's about God and his relationship with Israel and everything. But, again, even that son's not killed, right? Again, because the law is an example, provides examples of good justice. It doesn't say you definitely have to do this every single time. Notice that the law of Hammurabi, right, which we talked about, we said it's from about 1750. Notice we can compare it. It says, if the child of a courtier or the child of a secretary, whatever that is, I don't know what that is, should say to the father who raised him or to the mother who raised him, you are not my father or you are not my mother, they shall cut out his tongue. Okay? So if the child reared by a courtier or the child of a secretary identifies with his father's house and repudiates the father who raised him. So apparently he has an adopted father and he's going back to his father's house and say, no, that's my father. And repudiates the father who raised him or the mother who raised him and departs for his father's house, they shall pluck out his eye. Right? So again, this is a serious issue about respect among children because again, it will break down all of society. Right? All right, Exodus 23:19 and 34:26, and cooking a young goat in its mother's milk. This seems simply to be for humanitarian reasons. Okay? Note that the Torah forbids the following. At Deuteronomy 22:6-7, it says, if you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long. And then Leviticus 22:28 says, but you shall not kill an ox or a sheep and her young in one day. Right? And so again, there seems to be an understanding in Israel and maybe the ancient world where if the children die in the animals in the presence of the mother, then that's a bad thing, right? It's just wrong. Like you say, oh, that's just wrong, right? You can't do that. And if you boil an animal in its mother's milk, then they're like, that's just wrong. It's just, you don't do stuff like that, right? It's the only thing, there's no other reason given, and we don't know any other reason. Daughter of a prostitute burned to death? What? Leviticus 21:9 says, and the daughter of any priest, notice this, of a priest, if she profanes herself by whoring, profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. Okay? Now again, that's a horribly, harsh punishment. But note that if the daughter is promiscuous, the daughter of a priest, again, we're only talking about the daughter of a priest, the priest has to be ceremonially clean to go before God. And if he goes before God and he's not clean and he didn't realize it, he could literally die. Like he could be burned up, right? And so the point here seems to be that lest she accidentally comes home and because she's unclean, somehow makes him unclean, and then he inadvertently goes to serve in the temple and then he's killed, well, she really messed him up, right? And so the rule here says, listen, this is so serious that the priest may end up dead, that if this happens, the daughter is to be killed, right? And so again, that's the deal. We don't want to be having the priest killed off. The Urim and the Thummim, interestingly, just for the record, they still use they don't use it still. But Joseph Smith in Mormonism, Joseph Smith claimed to have had a Urim and Thummim that he used to divine the will of God. Again, that's because they use the King James Bible, and he saw it in there, and he's like, oh. Exodus 28:30 says, and in the breastpiece of judgment you shall put the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be on Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. Thus Aaron shall bear the judgment of the people of Israel on his heart before the Lord regularly. So again, apparently the Urim and the Thummim were used in the casting of lots. It may be that the Urim was a dark stone and that the Thummim was a light stone. And so therefore the light stone meant yes and the dark stone meant no. And so what you would do is you would ask God, God, is this, should we do this thing? And then you would reach in, you would pull out the stone, and that's the way they divine the will of God, right? Now, you say, well, wait a minute, that sounds like bad stuff that they shouldn't have been doing. At no point where it talks about the Urim or the Urim and the Thummim, is it seen in a negative light. And you certainly have in the Old Testament examples of casting of lots. Again, we talked about it when we talked about Jonah, right? They casted lots, and it went to him, and that's the way God divined his will to those people. So there you have it. All right. The sins of the parents in one place, I'm just going to say this quickly. In one place, it seems that the sins of the parents, Exodus 34:7, says that it will be sent on the children to the third and the fourth generation. But then later on in Deuteronomy 24:16 and Ezekiel 18:4, it basically says that that's not the case. So what does that mean? Does that mean that God is going to punish children to the third and fourth generation? It doesn't seem so, because again, that would be a major issue, because it seems to say both. It seems to be what we think of today as like generational poverty, right? And so let's say that, and I'm not saying everybody has to go to college, okay? There are trades and all that. But let's say that your parents do not take education or trade seriously, and they don't have good jobs, or they live off the government. Well, the chances are that you, as their child, you're going to be in the same boat. Your children are also going to be in the same boat. Their children are also going to be in the same boat. And so it is a generational poverty situation which will continue on. All right, it is 7:29. So I'm going to stop. And what I think I'll do is next week, I think I'll start with this, because I do think next week's going to be a little lighter as far as there's not so much through our Bible readings yet. But we will talk about Azazel and sending the goat off to Azazel, which seems to be some sort of demon or whatever. It's funny, Zach and I had this conversation the other day, and we were talking about it, I think it was after Wednesday night. And so we will talk about that, and I'll give you some of the options of what that could mean. And kind of what's going on with all of that, or what it could be. We don't know exactly, because we don't know what the word Azazel means for sure. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.